What would you do if you woke up and saw strangers cutting your ranch gate open at dawn? And what if those strangers claimed they had authority over land your family had protected for generations? That was the question pounding through my head as I stood barefoot on my porch, staring at a sight that should never have been possible. The morning air was cold enough to sting my lungs, but the real shock came from something far more chilling. Three people I had never seen before slicing through the heavy chain on my front gate like it meant nothing. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. My brain refused to accept what my eyes were showing me. This was my ranch, Mercer Ranch, land my father fought to keep, land my grandfather built from dirt and sweat. Nobody had ever crossed this boundary without permission, yet there they were, dressed in matching vests with little HOA badges pinned on their chests, stepping through the gate they had just destroyed. And behind them stood Evelyn Carr, the president of the Oak Ridge Meadows HOA, arms folded, chin lifted, wearing the kind of smug smile that told me she believed she belonged here more than I did. When the chain finally clattered to the dirt, the metallic echo rolled across the pasture, startling the horses. Their hooves pounded against the frozen earth as they scattered, snorting in panic. I smelled diesel from the HOA's utility cart before I smelled the cold dust rising from their boots. Every step they took across my land pressed deeper into my anger. None of them looked at me. None of them asked permission. They just walked in as if my entire ranch were some backyard they needed to inspect. I stormed off the porch and crossed the yard, adrenaline sharpening every sound around me, the hiss of their bolt cutters hitting the ground, the low hum of their engine, the restless breathing of my horses. "Get off my property!" I shouted, but Evelyn barely spared me a glance. "John," she said, her voice sugary with condescension, "we're conducting an inspection. Your compliance issues have gone unaddressed for months." Compliance issues. The words almost made me laugh. My ranch existed decades before their neighborhood even had roads. I wasn't part of their HOA. I wasn't under their rules. And yet she spoke with the confidence of someone who believed paper titles granted real power. "You don't have inspection rights here," I told her. "You don't have jurisdiction here at all." Her smile tightened. "We'll determine that," but she wouldn't. She couldn't. HOAs cannot enforce rules beyond their platted boundaries. Every attorney in the state knows that. What scared me wasn't their lack of authority. It was the arrogance with which they ignored it. Why were they targeting me? Why now? Why my land? My jaw clenched as they continued walking deeper onto the ranch. I shouted again, louder this time, but Evelyn raised a finger in the air like she was dismissing a misbehaving student. Rage mixed with disbelief until my chest felt tight. This wasn't confusion anymore. This was a violation, one I could feel in my bones. I didn't know it yet, but that morning was the beginning of a war I never asked for, a battle I couldn't avoid. When I stepped closer, Evelyn finally leaned in, her breath fogging in the cold. With a voice so calm it sent a chill through me, she whispered, "John, you have no idea what's coming." And she was right. I didn't. But I would soon. How does a man who lives miles outside city limits suddenly get dragged into an HOA war he never agreed to? I asked myself that question over and over after that morning at the gate, because trouble like that doesn't start overnight. No, trouble like that builds quietly, layer by layer, until the day it finally shows its face and takes a bite out of you. And looking back now, I can see exactly when the first crack appeared. It was the day construction trucks rolled across the field next to my ranch, carving out the foundation for what would become the Oak Ridge Meadows subdivision. Back then, I didn't think much of it. My family had owned this ranch for over 80 years. Developments had come and gone around us. None had ever bothered us before. But this one was different. It grew fast, too fast. And with it grew a culture of rules, regulations, and people more interested in appearances than community. Rows of identical houses sprang up like weeds after rain. By the time the last street was paved, the homeowners association was already forming, and at the center of it was Evelyn Carr. Around that time, I met Mike Dalton, one of the new residents. He showed up at my fence line one afternoon, leaning on the post like he'd been waiting to speak to me. "John," he said, "you're going to want to watch out for the HOA. They start small, then they take over everything." I laughed it off then. What could an HOA possibly want from me? My ranch wasn't part of their subdivision. My land wasn't listed under their covenants. I live my life by weather patterns and cattle schedules, not by arbitrary rules written in a binder. But Mike's warning stuck with me longer than I expected. The first real sign came in the form of a letter. Thin, white envelope, Oak Ridge Meadows letterhead printed in bold green. Inside was a notice accusing me of violating architectural standards by having a fence that did not meet HOA height requirements. I remember standing on my porch laughing out loud. My fence had been there long before Evelyn ever dreamed of running a neighborhood committee. I tossed the letter aside and assumed that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. A few weeks later, Evelyn herself showed up at my ranch. She wore a bright smile, carried a clipboard, and pretended she wanted to welcome me to the community, even though I wasn't part of it. She complimented the land, complimented the barn, complimented the view, but her eyes moved differently. They weren't admiring, they were measuring, scouting, calculating. Something about that visit unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. And after she left, small things began happening. Survey markers appeared along the property line, even though I hadn't ordered any. I found a man taking photos near my barn early one morning. Notices kept arriving, warnings about unapproved structures, non-compliant fencing, and improper land maintenance. None of them applied to me, yet all of them had my name on them. Piece by piece, it became clear the harassment wasn't accidental. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't paperwork errors. It was intentional, coordinated, and growing bolder every week. The day they trespassed onto my ranch wasn't the beginning. It was simply the moment they stopped pretending. And the moment I realized that came when I opened my mailbox and found something that made my stomach twist with disbelief. A fine. A fine for $100 and $200. From an HOA I never joined. What would you think if you saw camera flashes near your barn after midnight? And what if a drone hovered over your roof as if tracking your every move? For most people, those questions live in the realm of imagination, the stuff of paranoia and suspense movies. But for me, they became reality, unexpected, unwelcome, and terrifying in a way I never thought possible, on land I believed was safe. After receiving that $100 and $200 HOA fine, I expected anger, maybe a heated conversation, maybe some legal posturing. What I didn't expect was a silent war fought in the dark. It started one cold night when the wind carried the faintest mechanical buzz across the pasture. I knew that sound instantly. It wasn't a cicada, wasn't a distant engine, wasn't anything natural. It was a drone, and when I stepped outside, the moonlight caught the reflection of something small drifting overhead, weaving above the cattle as if it were cataloging each one. My horses paced restlessly beneath it. The drone hovered over my house for several seconds, blinking red in the darkness, before drifting back toward the Oak Ridge Meadows subdivision. I tried to convince myself it was a fluke, some kid messing around with a toy. But the next night I saw something even worse, a flash of light near the tree line by the barn. Not lightning, not headlights. A camera flash. I stood still listening, and in the silence of the night, I heard faint footsteps crunching through dried leaves near the fence line. Whoever was out there wasn't just passing by. They were watching. The following morning, I found fresh boot prints by the north pasture gate, prints that didn't belong to any of my ranch hands. The feeling in my gut shifted from irritation to unease. The trespass at dawn had been bold, loud, arrogant, but this was different. This was sneaky, calculated. Someone was keeping tabs on me when they thought I wouldn't notice. When I finally confronted Evelyn about it at the edge of her subdivision, she didn't blink. Routine compliance documentation, she said, as if photographing and surveilling private ranch land in the dead of night was completely normal. As if she had the right to monitor me. But laws across many states restrict surveillance over private property, especially when it involves drones or photography without consent. Evelyn knew this. She just didn't care, and that made everything worse. My ranch had always been my refuge, a place where the only sounds at night were the wind through the grass, the occasional restless horse, and the low hum of insects. Now every noise felt suspicious. Every shadow looked too intentional. My peace was gone, replaced with the constant awareness that someone might be out there, watching. So I began documenting everything. I installed cameras on the barn, on the fences, near the gate. I kept a notebook with dates, times, descriptions, anything I could remember. My annoyance hardened into something heavier: fear, anger, and a sense of betrayal. A man's home is supposed to be the one place he never feels hunted. Yet every night I found myself standing by the window, scanning the darkness for movement. But nothing prepared me for what happened next. Because one night, after weeks of mysterious flashes, buzzing drones, and silent footsteps, I walked out to the fence line and caught someone in the act. Not a neighbor, not a contractor, an HOA inspector, climbing over my fence like a thief breaking into a house. How far would someone go when they believe a title and a clipboard give them power over your life? That question hit me like a punch the moment I saw the HOA inspector straddling my fence, halfway between trespassing and fleeing. His flashlight beam froze when it landed on my face. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. Then rage, cold, controlled, and overdue, rose up through me. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate violation. "Get down," I said, my voice low and steady. The man hesitated, then dropped to the dirt on my side of the fence. Before I could say another word, he reached for his radio, muttering something about being confronted by the homeowner. Minutes later, headlights cut through the darkness. Evelyn Carr herself came marching toward us, her heels crunching the gravel, her face burning with fury. "What did you do to him?" she shouted before she was even close enough to hear my answer. "Did you lay a hand on my inspector?" I stared at her in disbelief. "Your inspector was climbing over my fence," I said. "On my land, at night, without permission." She ignored every word, stepping between us as if shielding a victim. "This is harassment, John. This is intimidation. We have every right to inspect compliance issues." I almost laughed. Compliance? At nearly midnight, under cover of darkness, with no notice, no warrant, no jurisdiction. But she wasn't finished twisting reality. Evelyn raised her voice, projecting it into the night as if hoping the stars themselves might serve as her witnesses. "He felt threatened," she said loudly. "That's grounds for legal action against you." Before I could respond, red and blue lights rolled toward us. The sheriff's truck. I felt a wave of relief I hadn't realized I needed. Deputy Morales stepped out, calm and steady, a man who'd known my family for years. He listened to both sides, though it was painfully clear Evelyn expected him to arrest me on the spot. The deputy took his time, shining his light along the fence line, examining footprints, and asking the inspector to explain why he was climbing over private property boundaries after dark. The man stuttered. Evelyn tried to jump in, but Morales held up a hand, silencing her mid-sentence. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "this property is not part of your HOA. You have no authority to enter it, and certainly no authority to conduct nighttime inspections." The look on Evelyn's face was something I'll never forget. Shock mixed with shame, both wrapped in a blanket of stubborn denial. She couldn't argue with him, but she couldn't accept the truth either. "So he just gets away with threatening my inspector?" she demanded. "No one was threatened," Morales replied. "But you and your people are trespassing, and it stops tonight." Evelyn's jaw tightened. The inspector looked at his shoes. I felt the tension in my chest ease, not because the problem was solved, but because someone finally acknowledged what I'd been dealing with. As the sheriff escorted them off my land, a new realization formed inside me. Anger alone wouldn't protect my ranch. I needed strategy, records, evidence, a plan. From that night on, I began documenting everything with a different mindset. Not as a frustrated landowner, but as a man preparing for a legal battle he never asked for. I thought the worst was behind me, but the very next morning, a certified letter arrived in my mailbox. One that made my blood run cold. The HOA was declaring its intent to annex part of my ranch. Why would an HOA risk criminal charges just to step foot on my ranch? What were they hiding behind their obsession with compliance? Those questions kept circling through my mind long after the sheriff escorted Evelyn and her inspector off my land. The trespassing, the drone, the nighttime surveillance, none of it made sense if all they wanted was to enforce rules. Rules don't matter at midnight. Rules don't require broken gates, or threats, or secret photos. No, there had to be another motive, something bigger, something worth risking everything for. I didn't get answers until Mike Dalton showed up the next morning, leaning on my fence the same way he did when he first warned me. His expression was tense, like he'd been carrying a secret too heavy to hold any longer. "John," he said quietly, "you need to know what Evelyn's been pushing behind the scenes. They don't want compliance. They want land. Your land." A cold weight settled in my stomach. Why my land? Mike hesitated, then told me the rumor spreading inside the subdivision. Oak Ridge Meadows wanted a community walking trail, a scenic path to boost home values and attract wealthier buyers. The problem? The most beautiful stretch of land in the area belonged to me. My open pasture, my creek line, my old oak trees. Evelyn wanted them for the HOA, not to borrow, not to rent, to annex. But it went beyond her. The name Harold Burns surfaced, developer, businessman, and the slickest talker this county had ever seen. Harold had been whispering promises at board meetings about expansion opportunities and value enhancement. According to Mike, Harold and Evelyn had been working together for months. Suddenly, everything clicked. The trespassing wasn't chaos. It was scouting. The drone wasn't surveillance. It was mapping. The photos weren't documentation. They were planning materials. Later that week, Mike handed me something that confirmed everything. Printed emails from a sympathetic board member who could no longer stomach what Evelyn was doing. The emails were blunt, shameless even. Harold described my land as underutilized acreage that could easily be incorporated into community features. Evelyn wrote about strategic annexation and leveraging HOA authority to prompt cooperation. My hands shook as I read them. And then came the one line that burned itself into my memory. If we gain access to even 2 acres, home values could rise by 15 to 20%. So that was it. My land wasn't a nuisance. It was a gold mine. They weren't trying to fix anything. They were trying to take something. Evelyn, of course, tried to disguise her greed under the banner of community improvement. She paraded around telling residents that annexing part of my ranch would enhance the neighborhood experience and promote outdoor wellness. She never mentioned that annexation requires one thing they would never get from me: voluntary consent. The law was on my side, but Evelyn had already shown she didn't care about laws when they didn't benefit her. The realization hit me harder than I expected. I wasn't just dealing with harassment. I was standing in the way of a lucrative expansion plan, blocking a project that greedy hands were already counting profit from. Suddenly, the boldness of the trespassing made perfect sense. They weren't worried about consequences because to them, the reward outweighed the risk. But they underestimated me. They underestimated what a man will do to protect what his family built. Just as I started planning my next steps, my phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar county number. A voice on the other end said, "Mr. Mercer, we're scheduling a mandatory inspection of your property. When does harassment become a fight for your dignity, your safety, and your home?" That question settled into my bones the moment the county's so-called mandatory inspection was scheduled. I knew then that this wasn't a misunderstanding or a territorial dispute. It was an assault on everything my family spent generations building. And if I didn't push back now, they would take more than land. They would take control. The first step was hiring an attorney, someone who understood the psychology of HOA abuse better than I did. That's how I found Sarah Whitford. From the moment she walked into my living room, dropping a thick binder of case histories onto my table, I knew she was the right choice. Sharp, unwavering, and with a reputation for dismantling corrupt HOAs, she didn't flinch when I told her everything Evelyn and the board had done. "John," she said, flipping through the emails Mike had given me, "this isn't harassment. This is coercion, and they're sloppy. That's good for us." For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to hope. Sarah instructed me to create a complete evidence file. Videos from my security cameras, logs of suspicious activity, photos of survey markers, copies of every letter, every notice, every threat. I spent days gathering everything, reliving each violation, each intrusion. She organized it into categories: trespass, surveillance, fraud, harassment, annexation attempts. Seeing it all laid out made the truth undeniable. The HOA had orchestrated a campaign against me, but collecting evidence wasn't enough. Sarah insisted I upgrade security, not just to protect the ranch, but to protect the case. So I installed motion sensors along the tree line, reinforced the barn locks, and replaced the old front gate with a heavier steel barrier. Every hammer strike, every drill bite into wood, felt like building a shield around my own sanity. But even with the upgrades, my ranch no longer felt peaceful. The silence between dusk and dawn wasn't comforting anymore. It felt like an empty stage where something dangerous might step out at any moment. Every rustle of leaves made me turn my head. Every passing vehicle made my shoulders tense. My home had transformed from a place of rest into a battlefield waiting for the next attack. Meanwhile, whispers spread among the neighbors. People who once waved in passing now avoided eye contact, afraid of being seen talking to me. Others, quieter but braver, approached me privately. They told me Evelyn had been growing more aggressive, demanding stricter compliance, threatening fines, accusing residents of undermining community values if they questioned her authority. Oak Ridge Meadows wasn't a neighborhood anymore. It was a place where people lived under constant inspection, and I had become Evelyn's obsession. But I refused to be intimidated. Sarah made it clear, the best weapon against corruption is exposure. So I prepared myself, not just emotionally, but publicly. I printed documents, organized files, documented everything with timestamps. If they wanted war, I would not be the one caught unprepared. I stood taller. I spoke firmer. I refused to retreat one more step. But none of that mattered when the next move came. Not from the shadows, not from letters, but from raw machinery and arrogance. It happened on a bright afternoon. I was repairing a loose hinge on the barn door when the ground began to tremble. Not subtly, violently. I turned toward the road, and dust clouds rose behind a yellow bulldozer crawling toward my property line. Behind it, Evelyn stood with a rolled-up map in her hand, looking triumphantly certain. "We're clearing easements today," she called out, as if announcing a routine maintenance job instead of an invasion. And the bulldozer kept coming. What would you do if a bulldozer started rolling toward land your father and grandfather protected with their bare hands? For some people, the answer might be to call for help, to retreat, to wait for someone else to decide what happens next. But when I saw that machine crawling toward my fence, throwing clouds of dust into the air, something ancient and immovable rose up inside me. A man can tolerate harassment, insults, even threats, but when someone threatens the very ground your family sacrificed for, the line finally snaps. The bulldozer roared as it crept toward the wooden posts that had stood for decades. I could see the blade already lowered, ready to tear through everything it touched. Evelyn marched behind it like a general leading an army, waving the rolled blueprint as if it granted divine authority. The operator looked reluctant, glancing back at her for reassurance, but she kept shouting forward, "Clear the easement. Keep moving." An easement that didn't exist. My heart hammered with a mix of fury and disbelief. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I simply stepped forward and planted myself directly in front of the bulldozer's path. Dust blew into my face. The machine jerked, hesitated, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I held the power. The operator slammed the brake and threw his hands up, shouting, "Lady, he's standing right there." Behind him, Evelyn shrieked, "He's obstructing a legal process. Proceed." "Legal?" I yelled back. "You don't even have jurisdiction here." My voice echoed across the property, reaching the growing group of neighbors gathering at the roadside. Some held their phones up, recording everything. Others whispered among themselves, finally seeing what I had been battling alone. But Evelyn didn't care about witnesses. She only cared about winning. The tension snapped when the sound of sirens pierced the air. 2 sheriff deputies pulled up, dust swirling around their boots as they stepped out. The operator practically ran to them, hands shaking, desperate to get out of the middle of the madness. Deputy Morales approached first, jaw clenched. "Everybody step back," he ordered. Then he turned to Evelyn, who was already pointing at me, shouting accusations about obstruction and non-compliance. Morales raised a hand, silencing her. "Ma'am, before you say another word, show me the legal documentation for this easement." Evelyn hesitated. For the first time, she looked unsure. When she finally unrolled the blueprint, Morales studied it for less than 10 seconds before shaking his head. "This isn't an easement. This is a proposed path." "Proposed doesn't mean approved," Evelyn sputtered. "But the community—" He cut her off. "This land is not under your HOA. You cannot authorize work here. Period." The crowd murmured. Cameras zoomed in, and for the first time since she began harassing me, Evelyn's confidence cracked. Her face flushed a deep red, her jaw tightening as if she could physically hold her authority together. Sarah arrived minutes later, breathless, legal pad in hand. When she heard what happened, the look in her eyes shifted into something sharper than fury. "John," she said quietly, "this is malicious intent. This is exactly what we needed. The evidence, the witnesses, the deputy's ruling. It all aligned in a way no lawyer could manufacture." Evelyn had shown her hand, and now the law was finally paying attention. Deputy Morales pulled me aside as the bulldozer retreated and the crowd dispersed. His voice dropped to a low, serious tone. "John," he said, "you need to file an emergency injunction, immediately. Have you ever reached the point where you stop defending yourself and start fighting back? It's a moment when something shifts inside you, when fear transforms into resolve, when exhaustion sharpens into purpose. After the bulldozer incident, I reached that moment. Standing there, covered in dust and adrenaline, with deputies confirming what I had known all along, I realized I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was preparing to win. The next morning, Sarah and I sat at my kitchen table sorting through every document, recording, and witness statement we had collected. "John," Emma said, tapping her pen against the evidence folder, "it's time to go on offense." Those words felt like the first breath of fresh air I'd taken in months. We began by filing formal criminal trespass complaints against the HOA members involved in the nighttime fence climbing incident and the bulldozer stunt. Sarah recorded my statement, attached time-stamped video footage, and cross-referenced it with property line maps. From there, she prepared the emergency injunction paperwork, pages and pages outlining the HOA's harassment tactics, unlawful surveillance, attempts at coercion, and the blatant disregard for property law. The sheriff's department took the complaints seriously this time. Deputies had witnessed the bulldozer confrontation themselves, and public pressure was rising. News spread fast in small communities, and Oak Ridge Meadows wasn't immune. People started whispering, questioning, wondering if Evelyn had taken her power too far. Slowly, the tide began to shift. Neighbors who had previously avoided me now nodded cautiously at the fence line. A few even stopped by while I worked, lowering their voices as they confessed they felt intimidated by Evelyn too. "She fines people for having the wrong mailbox number font," one woman whispered. Another admitted he'd been cited for having a garden hose visible from the street. These weren't residents, they were prisoners living under constant scrutiny. Then Mike approached me with a bold idea. "Attend the next HOA meeting undercover. You need to see how she talks about you when you're not there," he said. With a borrowed jacket and a baseball cap pulled low, I followed him into the community clubhouse. Rows of homeowners filled the folding chairs, tension thick enough to taste. When Evelyn took the podium, her voice dripped with authority. "We have a serious situation with a dangerous, unstable landowner bordering our community," she announced. My stomach twisted as she painted me as a threat. Reckless, aggressive, unpredictable. She spoke as if I were lurking at the edge of their subdivision with a weapon instead of a ranch fence. But something was different this time. The board members didn't nod enthusiastically like before. They exchanged uneasy glances. A few crossed their arms. One man cleared his throat as if ready to object. There were cracks forming in Evelyn's command, hairline fractures of doubt. During a short break, as people filed out for refreshments, a woman I didn't recognize approached me. She looked over her shoulder twice before slipping a folded packet of papers into my hand. "You didn't get these from me," she whispered, "but you need to see what they're planning." Then she walked away without another word. When Mike and I returned to my truck later that night, I opened the packet under the dim cabin light. My pulse pounded as I scanned the printed emails, internal HOA correspondence between board members, Evelyn, and developer Harold. The deeper I read, the colder I felt. One message stopped me dead in my tracks. They weren't just trying to annex land. They planned to pressure John until he gives up 2 acres. If you had proof of corruption, would you dare walk into the county office and expose it all? Would you risk making powerful enemies just to defend what's yours? These questions were still pulsing in my head the morning I gathered every email, every video clip, every map, and every time-stamped report into a thick binder. My hands shook, not with fear, but with the weight of what I was about to do. I wasn't just fighting an HOA anymore. I was challenging people who thought they could reshape an entire county to fit their agenda. The county attorney's office sat in an old brick building that smelled faintly of dust and forgotten paperwork. When I walked in with Sarah, the receptionist raised an eyebrow at the sheer size of the binder we carried. Within minutes, we were escorted to a conference room where Assistant County Attorney Mark Halston, a man known for digging into political scandals, waited. Sarah did what she did best. She laid out the evidence with surgical precision. First came the drone footage, then the trespass recordings, then the bulldozer confrontation. Halston scribbled notes, his expression tightening. But the moment we placed the internal HOA emails on the table, documenting annexation schemes, coercion strategies, and Harold's promises of increased profit, everything shifted. "This," he said, tapping the page with a steady finger, "isn't a misunderstanding. This is zoning manipulation with intent to defraud." And with that, the investigation began. Within 48 hours, the county investigator, a tall, quiet man named Baxter, visited the HOA office unannounced. Residents later told me they saw board members pacing nervously inside, papers shuffling frantically, doors slamming. Evelyn tried to maintain her usual air of dominance, but it didn't last long. Baxter served her a formal notice of investigation right in front of half the neighborhood. She turned pale, her confidence evaporating faster than dew on hot concrete. That was the moment panic spread through Oak Ridge Meadows. Suddenly, Harold Burns, the developer who had been feeding the board grand visions of expansion, distanced himself from the HOA with lightning speed. Contractors later told me he ordered all communication with Evelyn to be paused. Rumors swirled that he deleted entire email chains and blamed the HOA for acting independently. Just like that, the alliance between Evelyn and Harold cracked open. And once residents got wind of the investigation, the complaints came pouring out. People who had silently suffered under Evelyn's rule finally spoke up. A retired couple reported being fined for leaving their trash bin out too long. A single mother said Evelyn threatened her with legal action for having a kiddie pool in her yard. Others admitted they'd been too scared to challenge her before. Now that someone else had stood up, they found their voices too. It wasn't long before my story spread beyond the subdivision. A local journalist contacted Sarah after hearing about the bulldozer incident. The sheriff's office confirmed they had responded to multiple calls involving the HOA. Neighbors began sharing videos online. The situation was no longer a quiet conflict on private land. It was becoming a public spectacle. For the first time, people were seeing Evelyn for who she really was. But exposure doesn't humble everyone. For some, it ignites something far darker. Later that week, after a long day submitting additional documents to the county, I walked out to the parking lot alone. The sun hung low, casting long shadows. As I reached my truck, a voice cut through the silence behind me. "John." I turned. Evelyn stood near the building, eyes burning with rage, her voice a low growl, dripping with venom. "I will bury you before I lose." What do people do when they've lost control, lost credibility, and are about to lose everything? Some accept their mistakes. Others learn from them. But people like Evelyn Carr, they double down. They claw, they scheme, and they strike in the dead of night, hoping darkness will hide the truth. But darkness has a way of revealing the things people try hardest to conceal. After her threat in the parking lot, I knew Evelyn wouldn't retreat gracefully. What I didn't expect was how far she'd go once she realized the county investigation was no longer a rumor, but a reality. The first sign came 2 nights later. At around 2 a.m., my motion sensor cameras triggered an alert on my phone. At first, I thought it might be a stray animal or wind-triggered debris. But when I opened the live feed, my breath caught. 3 figures were creeping along my fence line, crouching low, flashlights pointed at the ground as if searching for something or planting something. Their movements were deliberate, rehearsed almost. I grabbed my boots, rushed outside, and watched from the shadows as they climbed over the fence with practiced ease. The cameras captured everything: their faces, their gear, their whispered conversations. They weren't random trespassers. They were HOA members, and they were back. This time, I didn't yell. I didn't confront. I simply recorded, called the sheriff, and waited. Deputies arrived silently, trapping the trespassers between the barn and the fence. What happened next played out like a scene I never imagined would unfold on my land. 2 HOA members were handcuffed under the glow of my barn lights, their excuses tumbling out in panicked fragments. "We're checking easement markers. We thought we had permission. We're helping the community." But the truth came out the next morning. When confronted, Evelyn denied everything. She told deputies she never authorized an inspection, never instructed anyone to enter my property, never even knew they were out there. But Sarah had anticipated something like this. She pressed for their phones to be checked, and that's when the Chiandis evidence surfaced. An audio recording of a call from earlier that evening where Evelyn clearly instructed them to document violations and gather proof before the next county review. Her voice was unmistakable. With that recording in our hands, Sarah updated the complaint file, adding new charges: conspiracy to commit trespass, retaliatory harassment, and attempted manipulation of county proceedings. Each accusation tightened the noose around the HOA's misconduct, leaving less and less room for Evelyn to escape. The fallout was immediate. The HOA board, once unified under Evelyn's intimidation, began to fracture. 2 members resigned within a day, claiming they had no knowledge of unauthorized activities. Another sent an apology letter to residents, admitting the situation had gotten out of hand. And as news spread about the midnight arrests, residents reached their breaking point. They demanded an emergency meeting to remove Evelyn from power. Flyers circulated, emails blasted, phone calls buzzed through the neighborhood. People who once feared Evelyn now rallied against her. The woman who once ruled Oak Ridge Meadows now stood as its greatest liability. But this fight wasn't over. Not even close. Sarah filed a motion requesting an emergency hearing to address the escalating danger posed by the HOA's unlawful actions. And given the severity of the recent trespass, the judge wasted no time. By the end of the week, we received the notice. A court date had been set, an emergency hearing, one that would determine the fate of the HOA leadership and the future of my ranch. Have you ever walked into a courtroom knowing everything you endured was finally about to matter. There's a weight that comes with that moment, a heaviness in the chest, a tremble in the hands, a quiet recognition that this is where the truth either rises or gets buried. After months of trespassing, threats, surveillance, and a bulldozer nearly tearing through my fence, the day of the emergency hearing arrived. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something close to peace. Not comfort, not safety, but the calm that comes from knowing you're no longer standing alone. When I stepped into the courtroom, the sight stopped me cold. The room was packed. Residents from Oak Ridge Meadows filling the benches, reporters lining the walls, cameras pointed toward the front like hungry eyes waiting to capture every second. Even the bailiff looked surprised at the turnout. This wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was a reckoning. Evelyn sat at the defense table, stiff as stone, jaw locked, her eyes darting from one spectator to the next. Harold Burns, the developer who once whispered big plans about my land, sat 2 rows behind her, pretending he wasn't connected to any of it. The board members who hadn't resigned looked pale, restless, whispering nervously among themselves. Then Sarah stood, carrying the binder that had become the backbone of our fight. "Your Honor," she began, "what we present today is not a misunderstanding, not a neighborly dispute, but a coordinated pattern of harassment, coercion, and unlawful trespass carried out by the Oak Ridge Meadows HOA and its president, Evelyn Carr." And with that, the room held its breath. Piece by piece, Sarah peeled back the layers of their misconduct. The drone footage, the nighttime surveillance, the trespassing incidents, the bulldozer confrontation, the internal emails exposing the annexation plot, the audio recording proving Evelyn ordered the 2 a.m. break-in attempt. Every document, every timestamp, every detail was displayed with precision that left no room for denial. When it was my turn to testify, I felt the weight of the entire courtroom shift toward me. I spoke about the sleepless nights, the fear of shadows along my fence, the violation of watching strangers record my land, the rage of seeing heavy machinery inch toward a fence my grandfather built by hand. My voice broke once, quiet but honest, when I said, my ranch was supposed to be the safest place I knew. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder as I stepped down. Then it was Evelyn's turn. She rose with a brittle confidence, claiming everything was misinterpreted, insisting she acted only out of community responsibility. But every excuse she attempted unraveled in seconds. The judge interrupted her repeatedly, his irritation growing with each evasive answer. "Miss Carr," he said sharply, "you do not have authority over land you do not govern. You do not authorize inspections at midnight. You do not order bulldozers toward private property. This is not leadership. This is abuse." Her face collapsed under the weight of the truth she could no longer outrun. In the end, justice came swiftly. The HOA was fined heavily. A permanent injunction was granted, barring them from stepping foot on my ranch again. Evelyn was removed from her position effective immediately. Harold Burns faced sanctions for his role in the attempted annexation scheme. And my land, my family's land, was finally, officially protected by court order. As reporters crowded around after the ruling, microphones and cameras pushed toward me. One voice rose above the others. "John," a reporter asked, "what's next for you now that you've won?" After everything was over, I stood alone in my pasture and wondered, why do some people believe power gives them the right to destroy others? The courtroom had emptied, the verdict was final, and the weight of months of conflict finally began to lift, but the question lingered like dust in the air. For the first time in a long while, I let myself breathe, really breathe, taking in the space around me, the land that had nearly slipped into the hands of people who never cared about it in the first place. The next morning, I woke to a silence I hadn't heard in months. No engine rumbling near the fence line, no headlights creeping through the early darkness, no drones buzzing overhead, just the soft rustling of grass, the steady snorts of the horses, and the kind of quiet that settles over you like a blanket. My ranch felt like itself again, whole, untouched, sacred. Peace had returned, one slow breath at a time. In the days that followed, neighbors from Oak Ridge Meadows approached me one by one. Some came with apologies, others with gratitude. A few admitted they had been too scared to speak out at first, worried Evelyn would turn her hostility toward them. One older man shook my hand with a trembling grip and said, "You didn't just protect your land, John. You protected ours too. Thank you." For the first time since the subdivision went up, I felt a sense of community, not forced, not artificial, but real. Evelyn didn't show her face again after the verdict. Word spread that she resigned from the HOA immediately, boxed up her things, and moved out under the cover of early morning. Some said she couldn't bear the humiliation. Others said Harold had abandoned her completely, leaving her to take the fall alone. Regardless of the reason, her departure felt like a storm finally passing. Whatever authority she once claimed dissolved the moment she drove away. The HOA board restructured afterward. New members stepped in, people who actually listened to residents instead of dictating their lives. Policies were reviewed, procedures rewritten, tempers cooled. For the first time, Oak Ridge Meadows started behaving like a neighborhood instead of a regime. And though I wasn't part of the HOA, several neighbors told me my fight had forced them to reclaim their own sense of autonomy. As for me, the months of harassment and intimidation left scars, emotional ones, the kind that remind you how fragile peace can be when power is placed in the wrong hands. But they also left lessons I'll carry for the rest of my life. Document everything. Know your rights. Never surrender what belongs to you. Not to fear, not to intimidation, and certainly not to people who believe control is the same thing as respect. Because respect isn't about authority. Respect is earned through boundaries, honesty, and the willingness to let others live their lives without interference. If there's anything my story proves, it's that no one, not an HOA, not a developer, not a self-appointed queen of a subdivision, has the right to take what's yours simply because they want it. And to everyone watching this, I'll say this: your voice matters more than you think. Stand up when something feels wrong. Defend what you love. And if this story taught you something, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it, because you never know who else might need the strength to fight back. I thought the chapter was closed, sealed tight with a judge's ruling and a quiet ranch.